Well, Michael Wysession is a professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. And for the 200th anniversary of the publishing of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein back in 2018, Dr. Wysession wrote the essay, Frankenstein Meets Climate Change, Monsters of Our Own Making. Michael Wysession, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Welcome, and happy Halloween.
Well, what made you want to research the connections between Frankenstein and climate change?
Well, this topic does something that I think is really a strength of academia, which is making connections between areas that people don't always see, obviously. I'd always been fascinated by the genre of horror stories and knew that Mary Godwin, later Mary Shelley, had written this story in a terrible summer in Switzerland in 1816, where it was cold and rainy and dark. And she was there with friends who wrote all these other horror stories as well. Lord Byron wrote a fragment of a vampire story that actually became the first English vampire story, finished by another friend of theirs, John Polidori there. And Mary, of course, wrote the iconic Frankenstein. As our university was beginning to prepare for the bicentennial in 1818, which is when she finished the book and not when she started it, I remember that the connection to this iconic climate change event that is significant also for my university in St. Louis, Washington University, because it determined the timing of the settling of states in the Midwest. And so as we were preparing for this, I brought in this additional aspect of the story of Frankenstein. And people jumped on it, and so we ended up putting that in as part of the set of essays of the collection that we put together. But what really struck me was, the year that she wrote it, 1818, or started writing it. Exactly 200 years later, I was invited to be the global lecturer on a National Geographic ship that went from Svalbard up in the Arctic Circle, up into the Arctic Circle, and then down the coast of Greenland. And we were supposed to be seeing thick pack ice with polar bears and seals, and there was just open water. There was almost no ice there. And of course, we saw the tragic polar bears stuck on Svalbard because they missed the ice where all the seals hang out. And I remembered that the story of Frankenstein actually begins and ends with a ship stuck in the ice. The movie with Boris Karloff doesn't bring that aspect into it, though there actually have been some made-for-TV miniseries since then that have incorporated that. But that was so striking to me because here I was on a ship up in the Arctic, and there was no ice. And that's 2016 ended up being a particularly thin ice year. Not only is the climate warming, but that was the year of an El Nino. And during an El Nino, basically, the world borrows some heat out of the Pacific Ocean. And so that was a real peak temperature year. And the ice was just dramatically thin. So that juxtaposition really stuck me and sort of set me on the track of thinking about the implications of this story.
Yeah, you touched on, what the temperature around the world was like during that time when Mary Shelley was writing Frankenstein. My co-host actually spoke with Brian Fagan, who's the author of the book Climate Chaos, about the year without a summer a couple of weeks ago. But for those in the audience that maybe they haven't listened to that episode or watched this video yet, can you tell us a little bit about that summer and what caused the incredibly cold summer?
Sure. The Earth system its climate system is like one of these complex Rube Goldberg machines that you see in an airport with balls falling and wheels spinning. And an important part of this system is the sloshing back and forth on a large scale in ocean basins of currents of water, which carry enormous amounts of heat with them. And so one of the major ones is the El Nino, La Nina, Enso cycle. And when this happens, you move the heat around the surface of the ocean, and that changes the atmospheric temperature patterns, or the atmospheric flow patterns, actually alters the jet stream. So places that normally get dry weather might get moist weather. Places that are normally cold might be warm. And one impact of this, apparently, during this year, was that a large volcano occurred in the Western Pacific, the island of Tambora, which is currently in the nation of Indonesia. This volcanic eruption ejected the equivalent of roughly about 100 cubic kilometers of ash and dust into the atmosphere, including, and this is really important for the climate, sulfur dioxide, which reacts in the atmosphere to form sulfuric acid droplets that tend to be like 0.1 to 0.3 nanometers in size. I mean, really small. And these block out some of the sunlight. So the total sunlight reaching Earth's surface dropped by about 10% for this period. Now, when that happens, the atmosphere gets heated differently, and the result is similar to what we see with these El Nino processes. The jet stream, the atmospheric patterns shift. And one of the results was that cold Arctic air came down across the eastern US during the summertime. And there were events of snowstorms in New England in June, July, and August. And now the year without a summer is an exaggeration. There certainly was a summer. The average temperature changes were only different by a couple degrees, both in New England and in Western Europe, by the way, which was also strongly affected. But it caused some of these severe weather events, and crops largely were incredibly poor that summer. As a result, there was a mass exodus of people out of New England. There were some towns like Granby, Vermont, that totally disincorporated. I mean, they just like, we're out of here, forget this. And they piled their belongings on wagons and headed out west. Now, of course, a decade earlier, Thomas Jefferson had pulled off like the biggest land steal in history with the Louisiana Purchase for a small amount of money, purchasing it from Napoleon. Nobody paid much attention to that at the time, though. However, when people were starving on the East Coast, they began moving out into these territories. And Indiana became a state in 1818, Illinois in 1816, Illinois in 1818, and Missouri in 1821. So the existence of my Washington University, which started around, in the sort of 1850s, happened only because of this year without a summer, this volcano on the other side of the world that triggered enough of the climate change to cause this migration of people. And this is emblematic of really our human history, because you can go back thousands, tens of thousands of years, the very rise of civilization and the rise and fall of individual civilizations, the mass migrations of people have been driven to a large extent by changes in climate, which change food production, which therefore drive trade, wars, migrations of people. And it's humbling and a little frightening for me to look back at the climate record and see that the temperature changes involved with these were actually quite small. And the temperature change we've currently been experiencing over the past century is actually significantly larger than some of these. So And, as a geologist, we look at the past and we have evidence of how these changes in climate can be massively significant to civilization. And it's a warning flag for the future.
So for those that might not remember the actual story, could you provide a high-level summary of what actually happens in Frankenstein?
So at the beginning of Frankenstein, there is a young ship captain by the name of Robert Walton. He's new, he's young, he wants to make his name in the world, but his ship gets stuck in the ice. And it's important to remember at this time, Western traders were driven by a desire to find the Northwest Passage, a route through the Arctic that would get down to China and Japan, which had already become big trade partners. But that trade had to go all the way around the outline of the continents. And they didn't have refrigerators, they didn't have batteries. Preserving food on long ocean ships was a real challenge. So to somehow find the shortcut across the Arctic was really key. And while Walton is stuck in the ice there, this nearly starving, crazed man stumbles upon his ship, Victor Frankenstein, and Walton takes him in and listens to Frankenstein's story. And then the story we know of, Frankenstein's playing God, basically, creating a body out of assembled dead parts, bringing it to life. That creature, his then horror at his creation and repulsion, that creation's revenge basically against Victor Frankenstein, eventually causing the death of everyone close to Victor Frankenstein. And then Victor fleeing away from it. That's the story that we know. And then back at the end, Victor does in fact die in Robert Walton's ship, and the monster appears and weeps and sobs over the dead body of his creator, and then heads off across the ice. And the story touches Walton, and he loses some of his hubris, and decides, I don't need to push this boundary, and makes a decision to head back, saving the lives of himself and his crew. And so, there are two possible stories here that we relate to. There is humanity as the Victor Frankenstein. And it's interesting that in the movie, we call the monster Frankenstein, but in fact, Frankenstein is the creator. But in a sense, his mania makes him more of a monster than the creature he actually brings to life. So in a sense, if climate is our monster that we've created, then we're really the monster who has created this. But the other story is kind of like Robert Walton. We can learn from our mistakes, from the stories of the past. Things like the year without a summer and its impact on climate, and maybe we can turn back in time. So there's a lot to be taken, I think, from this fabulous story that is relevant to our point in history.
Yeah. So Mary Shelley writes this during the heart of the Industrial Revolution. Do you think Shelley was using this story as a warning to those seeking technological and economic progress at the expense of the environment and society in general?
Yeah. Wilderness and industry and technology play very strong themes here. And you're absolutely right. Sort of England at this point was really beginning its industrial transformation. coal driven, so it was dark and dirty. The London fog that we talk of was actually London smog from all of the coal that was burned. And of course, the creature is often seen out in the wilderness, in the mountains of Switzerland, and this contrast of the urban cities, the laboratory, and where Frankenstein is constructing his creation, and then the beauty of the outdoors. That she really draws upon that contrast, and really, I think, poses it to the reader as a choice that we can follow.
Yeah, I think the monster sees itself as the result of its creator. It had the potential to be good, but it blames blames the creator for turning it evil. And I think there is a good analogy there with fossil fuels. It's undeniable that coal and oil have provided, the energy that really helped improve the lives of billions of people for over a century. But at the same time, it's also, undeniable that the burning of fossil fuels has heated the planet, caused the death and destruction, all around the world now and for centuries to come. You had mentioned earlier that you thought maybe, that we are Dr. Frankenstein, but do you see any similarities between the fossil fuel companies and are they the real life Dr. Frankenstein in this story?
I think you could say that. I think that's a kind of a way out for us, because I don't see they're any different from any other company that they follow a bottom line. They follow a narrow view. I think if you look at most corporations, their survival is limited by their ability to compete against their peers. And so let's say you left all environmental regulations up to all companies. Well, there would be no way that any company would spend the money to clean up their mess when other companies wouldn't have to. So there is a reason why unregulated industry can never function at long term within a society. You need a government to come in and say, to level the playing field. Like, all of you have to clean up your mess. It's like speaking to a bunch of children and saying, you three have to clean your table, clean up your dinner plate, but the fourth one you don't have to. And so it's our job as citizens, as governments, in order to be that regulation, to say, look, these are the standards. We need clean air, we need clean water, we need a functioning biosphere, and we need to. So then the oil and gas companies, when those regulations go in, they're often sometimes quite happy, because now everyone has to do that, and the field has been leveled. And certainly the evils and the millions of deaths that are resulting each year, maybe even tens of millions. It's millions alone just from lung disease from coal. The climate change with the droughts and the floods and the sea level rise. The whole mass exodus out of Syria was predicted by climate scientists. I mean, you can look at the genocides going on around the world. They're largely in areas of drought driven by climate. You can say that's a direct result of the fossil fuel industries, and that's really true. But we do have the ability to put the kibosh on that. As we're seeing in DC, that's not easy, and it works to relative degrees at different times, but we've also seen that it can. I look back at the 1950s, the killer fogs in London, killed thousands of people of lung disease. That was enough to trigger for England regulations on emissions. And same thing with the pollution that happened in the late 60s and 70s. The oil spills off Santa Barbara, the Cuyahoga River catching fire, that brought about the EPA. Even China, and I've been going to China for decades, you couldn't breathe there, and you couldn't even talk about it. But now the government is like, yeah, okay, we got a problem, and we're gonna change this. So humans have a capacity to suffer through a tremendous amount, but they do have a breaking point. And the question is, how much is broken on our planet before we reach that breaking point and say, enough, no more burning coal, no more burning oil. It helps tremendously that the levelized cost of energy from wind and solar is now cheaper than even combined cycle nuclear, natural gas in most parts of the world. And I don't normally want to leave these sorts of decisions up to the market. This is one case, though, where the market has really been bailing the world out, and the sort of exodus of investments from the coal industry in this case happened for the fact that it's just a dying, losing industry financially.
There are so many connections between Frankenstein and the climate crisis that we find ourselves today. There's actually a field of study called solar geoengineering that is basically trying to replicate the effects of the volcano that cooled the planet during Shelley's writing of the book. Are you concerned by the idea of humans flying planes around the world, spewing sulfates into the stratosphere in order to cool the planet and offset some of that warming caused by the burning of fossil fuels?
It's like doing a chemistry lab experiment, but you got one petri dish, and if you kill off your bacteria, you're done. We have one planet. And so, yes, I'm terrified of those sorts of experiences. Initial climate modeling shows that to do a large scale geoengineering exercise of putting large amounts of aerosols in the atmosphere may significantly decrease precipitation in some parts of the world, essentially driving increasing droughts. We just don't know really yet what the impacts of this is. It's far better just not to make the mess in the first place. And I will say, much of my time is now spent working with K-12 educators in writing the next generation science standards and writing, high school textbooks that talk about climate science. We do mention the potential role of geoengineering within that. The new next generation science standards, really for the first time in our country, integrate the problem solving design standards of engineering into them. And of course, geoengineering is a fascinating topic. Like, we could engineer our planet potentially. But we make a point of identifying the risks of doing that. Obviously, we have geoengineered our planet currently inadvertently to the point where we've increased global temperatures more than a degree Celsius in a flicker of a second, geologically speaking. And so, yeah, we can still tweak it more, but as an artist knows, crafting a sculpture, once you have an error and then you try to fix it and you try to, if you keep whittling away, you got nothing left.
So you had touched upon it earlier, but ultimately, do you find hope in the ending of Frankenstein, and what can we learn from the book?
Despite the gloom of the story, and Mary led a hard life, and it's, some of her struggles are really, and personal loss are reflected in the death of family members in the story. She does choose to have a potential of a hopeful ending there. I think, for me, I'm an educator. I began teaching high school physics and math in New York City. I went on to teach as a professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at a university for the past 30 years. I see our hope in the education of our children. I cannot tell you how much more aware, educated, conscious of climate systems the young children are than of people our generations. I'm probably a generation older than both of you. Both of our age groups, yeah, we get it a little bit. They get it. And so a lot of the changes that have happened in curriculum, including climate science as a major part of the sort of high school science curriculum, is at the insistence of students who, it's like, this is our future. We need to figure this out. And I have students who I advise who have incredible skills who are deciding to go into climate modeling, understanding Earth climate systems. They know how important this is. So, it takes a while, unfortunately. I'm sort of reminded of the Hebrew Bible's, 40 years in the desert. It may be that we all have to sort of die off before that generation is in place. But that awareness and that desire on the part of the younger generation is there. And that gives me hope.
Well, clearly, the more people that understand the climate crisis, the better. The earlier that we can educate students about the climate crisis, the better. And if we can use art like Mary Shelley did to kind of raise awareness of science and technological problems that could be facing humanity or society or the environment, that's all great too. So thank you so much for your work and your effort to spread that that awareness and education of the climate crisis. Thank you for writing that essay, this fantastic essay on the connections between climate change and Frankenstein. And thank you so much for joining the Climate Pod.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and again, happy Halloween.